Hi everyone, my name is Adam Davis. Welcome to Asset Validation and Why It's Important. Um, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a technical artist. I have been in the industry for about 12 years. About 5 of that was in technical art. Most of my focus has been on pipeline optimization, asset validation, pretty much anything on the back end to kind of help artists make uh, their assets more performant. And I was kind of the primary point of contact for asset validation for the division Heartland. It eventually helped rebuild the asset validation and pipeline to the engine for Xdeviant during my time there. So a lot of people don't really know what asset validation is. They think that it's just, artist finishes an asset, puts it into the engine, and it's good to go. Unfortunately, that's really not the ideal way to do things, and it's kind of a step that gets often overlooked within our industry as a whole. So, what asset validation is, it's kind of an in-between step where once an artist has finished an asset or is ready to put that asset into the engine, it goes to someone to go through a process of checks that goes over whether the asset meets the performance guidelines of the project, whether it has met the different technical metrics and barriers that are set up to make sure that everything is going to run smoothly, that you're going to get the highest frame rate possible and have it looking really good. Um, it's also making sure that things are within legal compliance or that anything that's like broken is fixed before it ever actually becomes a problem. Um, this is a step that it might seem like something that just should be done, but it's often something that gets overlooked in favor of expediency. Um, so I've put together a bit of a sample of what a pipeline typically looks like. And I did add a little bit of my personal opinion here that, yeah, oftentimes you don't need quite as much director level input as can be found at some studios. I have been at studios where this process takes weeks and weeks and weeks because it's like you come up with the start. Okay, the director has decided on a new asset that they want. It goes to the concept artist. Concept artist puts it back. Director says approval. Yes or no. If they say yes, it goes to the artist. Then you have to get it approved. Then it goes to me, the validator. Then the director has to approve. Then it goes to the next person. And you see how that kind of slows down the process. Really, as you can see here, the director needs to be involved in one, maybe two spots per asset, unless there is a problem down the line. And that should be after concept art. So they have sent it to concept art. Concept art says, hey, this is what we're looking at. This is what I think it should look like. Director says yes or no. If if no, it goes to shelve. It gets shelved, and we don't look at that asset again, or it gets sent back and uh, to the concept artist for review. Eventually, it goes to the artist. The artist, depending on your project, may need to send it back to approval again for the director. I generally don't think this step is necessary, but some studios do it. That's fine. It goes to engine integration next. This is where I come in. I take the asset, we put it through a series of checks, which we'll be going over here in a little bit. And then it's kind of a yes or no. Did it pass the integration stage? If yes, does the asset need further help? So in this case, it would be things like, does it need rigging? Does it need VFX? Does it need just additional assistance in editor or with other DCC tools that the initial I need this to be in the engine does not cover? If yes, then we send it to that specialist. Oh, I made a little mistake on this little chart here. That's supposed to say yes to the specialist. My bad. Uh, but if it doesn't need to go to the specialist, it goes right to the secondary approval, the final pass, which is, hey, this passes all of our checks. It doesn't need anything new. Go ahead. If it does need the specialist, you send it on to them, and then the process repeats in a truncated version. The asset comes back to me. I then look to make sure that the things that the specialist didn't break anything or didn't add any new issues that we need to be aware of, um, and then move forward. If it goes back to the specialist for something, then you send it back to them. If it gets approved, then the validation passes and it's at your gold standard. It's ready for to go. So when I say the checks that we're talking about, it's kind of a multi-phase thing. Um, so the first thing you want to do is actually get into the DCC tool. You're not even going to be importing yet. You want to go into the projects, into the DCC tool itself, make sure that a couple of things are already ready to go. Things like making sure the naming conventions are correct. This is a big one, especially for outsourcing, because what will happen a lot of times is they will name them according to their own conventions, or uh, there will be kind of a miscommunication at times between the insourcing and outsourcing individuals on what those naming conventions need to be. And so you might have to go in and rename assets inside of the DCC tool. So things like if you have a character and they're wearing a shirt, or they have pants or a weapon or things like that, those all need to make sure that they are individually named correctly. You don't want it to just be like your top end is named correctly and then all of the components of that are named whatever you want them to be named, and it's kind of all over the place. It makes it very difficult to find things. It makes it very difficult to keep track. And that's really, really important, is to make sure that everything is going to stay in kind of a consistent track throughout. The second part is triangles and polycount. This isn't quite as big of a deal if you're using something like Nanite, where it kind of controls that LOD in and out and things like that, and where triangle counts aren't quite as important, but in many cases they still are. And so you want to make sure that you're hitting kind of within the acceptable range for each type of asset. So things like hero assets, characters, anything that's going into cinematics are going to have much higher polycount allowances than a soda can or a box. So you want to make sure that the asset itself is sitting within that proper threshold. Um, of course, things like texture resolution sizes. Again, this is a big memory hit. Honestly, one of the biggest things that I tend to see when I'm looking at uh, like, let's say there's a loss of, like a memory drop or something like that, or a really big frame rate hit. A lot of it comes down to texture resolution and texel density. Uh, so checking those early and making sure that if you're importing textures, that they are of an appropriate size, or that they get resized to a more acceptable, workable level. That's really, really important to do early on. After that, it's mostly checking your export settings, like your texture compression settings, making sure that for Unreal Engine that you've got the right direction on it. So like X forward, Z up would be really important to make sure that your character is facing correctly, making sure that the pivot is in a sensible location, or that it makes sense for what you're building. Um, and what I mean by that is, and I'll show in a little bit, I have a practical example to go over, but um, when you're going over and you see where the pivot is, does it make logical sense? Generally, you want it like directly underneath, bottom in a corner, depending on the asset, something where the pivot will make sense. There are times where you have like multiple components that all go together and they only go together, where it may be okay to have that pivot off center, but you want to make sure that it's in a location that makes sense for that asset. And you want to go over that with the artist specifically to make sure that that is the intended functionality. And I can't stress that enough, that that is intended, because there are times where people they forget to center it, they forget to put the origins back together, they forget to freeze their transforms, things like that. These things happen. It's okay, but we want to make sure that we're catching those as early as possible. Once you have gone through all of this and you export the asset, the next step is making sure that your folder structure is correct. And we'll get into this in a little while. It is very critically important to make sure that your folder structure is set up correctly and that you are not importing assets from areas outside of the project files. Um, Typically, what I like to do is have a very specific source assets folder inside of the folder structure for the project, all that houses is your source files. And I usually separate it out by the type of asset that it is, and then going into the individual either software or individual file types. But I can show that in just a little while. Um, Oh, looks like I got a little bit ahead of myself. Oh, no, I didn't. This is important. Okay, cool. So yeah, once you've got that done, well, once you've got that done, you want to make sure that you go into the editor, and when you're importing, you want to check the import settings, which typically you don't have to change very much, at least not from my experience in Unreal Engine. But you want to check to make sure that the import settings are complying with what your project is looking for and what the asset is in particular is looking for. Um, the areas I've seen this most need to change are things like textures, where a texture may be imported as sRGB, but you meant for it to be imported as linear grayscale or something like that. So making sure that you check that the compression settings are correct, that it's loading with MIP maps, that it's loading in the correct direction, things like that. Very important. Checking the output log to make sure there's no errors or warnings that you're not aware of. Um, this in particular has some caveats in that there are times where there could be a change in, like, if you have some programmers doing changes in the code or something like that, they might have made a change that is throwing errors and things like that. And if they've already let you know, hey, this is a thing, don't worry about it. Trust them, not me on this front. Uh, and go with what they say. But other than that, if there's a warning or error, there's a reason for it. So double check to make sure that it's not throwing any specific errors, any specific warnings. If it is, make note of them. Um, that's kind of a general good idea, is just to make sure if the editor is telling you something is wrong, there's a reason for that, and you pay attention to it. Okay. So in general, there's a couple different types of checks that we do in editor once we've gotten past the import process. As I said, the asset validation, it is a whole process. This typically takes, like, once you get to this point, it's usually about 15 to 20 minutes per asset to do this. It's not really once you get used to it, it doesn't take as long as it seems like it will. But you have to get used to the process first, which for most people would take around 40 to 45 minutes per asset to kind of get through the checks and really get to understand them. Once you get comfortable with it, I'd say 20 to 25 minutes, unless there's something specific or it's a more detailed setup, or you have like a bunch of assets that you have to do at once. Um, so in editor checks, there's kind of three different types that I typically do: content browser, sub editors, and the level viewport. So the content browsers are pretty basic. It's things like making sure that your naming conventions came through and that it didn't try to append any weird stuff to the names, which it never does. That would be a very weird thing for it to do. So basically just making sure that your naming conventions are coming in, that you're putting it in the proper folders. And if you need to move folders, that you are fixing up redirectors. I cannot stress enough how important this step is. Um, Fixing up redirectors is, in my opinion, more important than most checks that you do, because when you submit to Perforce, when you submit to SVN, things like that, all of your local repository redirectors get submitted too. Usually. Sometimes they don't, depending on how you submitted. So if there are mismatches between the redirects on your local PC versus the redirectors that are in P4, then anyone else working on your project is not going to get is not necessarily going to get your redirectors that you have uploaded. So things start to break. We had this issue in a recent project that I've been working on, where things that one of us would work on were not registering the correct textures and things like that on other people's PCs. And we found out that it was because redirectors were not were possibly not being updated correctly from user to user across it. So the best way to solve that is to fix up your redirectors before you submit it, so that they don't have them. Because then you don't have to worry about it. It's just done, and it takes like 15 seconds I'll show you how to do it. It's not hard, but it is a step that a lot of people overlook, and it ends up causing problems, and then everyone's standing there going, why is this not working? That's possibly why. Um, so once you get past that, we want to go through your sub editors, things like the static mesh editor, the texture editor, whichever ones are relevant to the asset that you're working on. You don't have to check all of them for everything, but making sure that you're going through and checking each one for a couple specific components, which we'll go through in here in a moment. Finally, it's the level viewport. This is actually, in my opinion, the most important one. And so this is usually checking sub-editor content and then making sure that there aren't any kind of edge cases that the sub-editors didn't catch. So this will be things like checking to make sure your normals look okay in your lighting and things like that. Checking to make sure that there's not flipped normals that you didn't notice because the default lighting wasn't correct or something like that. So going through and doing these hard checks, especially like projectiles, collision, all sorts of stuff like that, it's all very important to make sure that these things are actually working correctly in your levels. I do recommend, and I'll get to this a little bit more in a bit, I do recommend when you do your level viewport that you check it inside of a level with like default lighting and then check and then kind of like do another check in one of your actual levels or the level that it's actually going to be in, because like the default lighting, you're going to be able to see generally anything that's wrong with it, but we can't always account for things that happen outside of that. Like if you did something very specific with your post process volumes, like let's say you're doing like an outline shader or something like that, or you've got some heavy vignette post processing, and the asset starts having problems specific to that vignette. Well, then you need to find out, is the problem with the asset itself, or is the problem with how you've got the vignette set up? And it kind of becomes a whole extra layered thing. If you've done the default lighting first, then you know what the asset is doing in a standard setup. So that kind of limits where the problem is possibly going to lie. It's kind of it seems like an extra step, but it's an extra step that saves you time later if there is a problem. So for the sub editor, this is usually what I do. Like I usually go content browser checks first, and then I go sub editor checks. And the reason is just because the level viewport honestly takes a little bit more time to set up. So double checking, because when the editor pulls in an asset, it does triangulate, so it'll break all of your quads into triangles and stuff like that. And so you want to go through, double check, make sure that you're still meeting your poly count, triangle count limitations. Um, if you've got LODs or nanite, you want to go through and make sure that those are working correctly. I have not personally messed with nanite, so I don't have as much to say on that particular topic. It's something that I'm looking into. But with LODs, going in and making sure that your LODs are actually transitioning and transitioning smoothly is really important, especially with assets where they transition fairly quickly, or where that transition could be very noticeable. So things like big water towers or billboard signs, and where that have like text and stuff like that. If the next LOD down doesn't have that text, but it's popping in at 100 meters, everyone's going to notice that. It's going to be very clear that there was an LOD pop, and you generally don't want clear LOD pops. So making sure that those are actually working the way they're supposed to be is really important. Um, Collision, making sure that your collision is enabled and that the collision looks correct. So a lot of people use, like when I worked on like Heartland and things like that, one of the things we would do is often have multiple layers of collision. So you'd have like the player collision, which was your collision with the world, things like walls, stuff like that, making sure that you're not going to clip through anything. Then you would have like projectile collision, so where bullets and things like that can hit, and then possibly grenade collision if you needed a separate thing from the player collision. And that was usually for things that had like holes in it, so you could throw a grenade through it, but your player couldn't walk through it, kind of thing. So you would want to have a separate thing for that. having those kind of broken down and making sure that each one is set up and correct is very good. One of the things that often came up was things like clipping, where some pieces of the mesh's collision would actually be dipping down into the object itself. And at that point, it's the collision may not register correctly because it's clipping underneath. So it's saying the arm is actually 2 inches, below where it's showing up. And you don't want that. You want to make sure that it's actually sitting just outside, that there's at least a little bit of space. Um, Projectile collision you usually want to be significantly more detailed. You want it to be much more close, but not quite matching the poly count of the asset. You want it to be much closer to that with the collision wireframe. That way your collisions are actually registering correctly if you're doing things like accurate bullet decals or things like that. So making sure that those are all set up and correct to use, if they even use them at all. If it's an asset that's not supposed to have collision and it has collision, it shouldn't. That's actually really easy to remove in the editor, and as a check you could probably do yourself. Then next part is like making sure that any material slots that are on the asset are used correctly. So if you have like a sci-fi wall and it has two different materials, one for the wall itself and one for an emissive line that goes through it, you want to make sure that both of those are utilized. You also want to make sure that the artist didn't get a bit overzealous with the amount of materials that are used, because at times, generally, we don't want a lot of textures or a lot of materials to be used because that becomes very heavy. So if there are things that could be done with texture masking and things like that, it's usually a better idea to do that than it is to have whole separate materials for the same thing. Um, so make sure that it's using a appropriate amount of textures that make sense for the asset. Checking to make sure the UVs are properly set up. So uh, this you want to make sure to go in, check your UV channels, make sure that they're all kind of generally within the 0 to 1 space. They're kind of fitting correctly. It's really important if you're using like, well, it's important in general, but it's particularly important if you're using baked lighting, to make sure that in the light map channel for UV1 that that channel does not have any overlapping UVs, that all of them are their individual islands and they have padding to make sure that the light is going to bounce correctly around the asset. You also want to check and make sure that if there's if the UVs are there, that when you put textures on it, that it's not areas that are stretching or squashing or kind of bent or pulled in any weird way, because that means that the UVs need to be fixed. That at least part of it is stretching incorrectly and probably needs to be rescaled. Um, Finally, checking destruction. This is different in Unreal than it was in Snowdrop, which is where I did most of my work. So I've not had as much opportunity to test this. However, um, in my opinion, going through and making sure that if an asset is supposed to have destruction, that it is set up, that it is correct. If you have to watch tutorials to do it like I do that. Make sure it has something. Um, if it needs to be fixed later, that's great. But make sure that if it's not you that's doing it, that whoever is supposed to be doing that gets it done. Because it's important to make sure that your destructible meshes are actually destructing. Um, so with textures are usually really easy. The first thing is making sure that the scale is fine, that the compression settings are correctly assigned. Um, if it has, which it should have MIP mask, so check to make sure that they're applying correctly and that when you're scaling in and out that it looks correct. That's pretty much it for most textures. You don't generally have to go through a whole crazy list of things with them. Um, Skeletal meshes have the same checks as the static meshes. The kind of main difference is to make sure that you go in and see that the skeletal mesh is properly assigned to the mesh itself, that it has an appropriate number of bones. So the more bones you have, just like with poly count and tri count, the more bones you have, the heavier the mesh is. So you want to try to limit it to what bones you need. And in many cases, you don't really need that many. Like if you're doing a swinging chain or something like that, you at most need two or three bones to get that effect, unless it's like really long or really, really detailed for some reason. Um, Whereas a character is going to need many more bones. They're going to need, their entire armature set up with, potentially full arms, legs, hands, fingers, all that stuff. So they have kind of more allowance for additional bones and additional weighting and things like that than something smaller that is probably just, you know, doing a little bit of detail work or things like that. It's just really important to make sure that if you're going to have skeletal meshes and stuff like that, that those are within reason for the type of mesh that you're going for. And then ensuring that if they have animations, that they are playing correctly. Now, this is an area, again, that I have a bit of a kind of weakness that I need to shore up. At uh, at Red Storm, and in particular on Heartland, we had a collection of animations that had been checked very early on and that were used pretty universally across our meshes. So we didn't have a lot of new animations coming in that we needed to check. Um, so the main thing for me is making sure that the animation is playing correctly and it's not doing anything weird when you play it. Um, if it is doing something weird and it does that across multiple meshes, that's probably a problem with the animation, not with the skeletal mesh. If it's a problem with this skeletal mesh, that means there's probably a problem with the weighting or something like that with the skeletal mesh. Um, so just kind of double checking to make sure that these things are actually working the way they're supposed to. A lot of the animation and skeletal mesh checks will probably be on your second validation pass, just because generally speaking, the initial integration is like, at least from my experience, it's always been this is the mesh that we're getting in, and then what we did was we would actually create a base rig for the rigger to work off of. So we would set up the base rig, import it, and so we knew that it was always coming in with the same base rig information. And then once the rigging specialist got done with the asset, we would then go back in and double check to make sure that the weighting was correct, that the rig looks good, that it's working correctly. Um, so that's kind of how that usually worked out. Uh, yeah, making sure a lot of it does come down to kind of what your studio has put forward. Make sure that there's documentation written down for this. Um, and the same thing with audio. Audio in general is checking to make sure that the file format matches the file formats that you accept. Make sure that the asset plays audio. I mean, at that point, it's not our. I guess let me rephrase. As the asset validator, it is not my job to judge the quality of the asset in terms of aesthetics or in terms of whether I like the asset or not. It is my job to make sure that it is technically working correctly. It is the artist's job and the art director's job to figure out, does it look good? Does it feel good? Does it match our aesthetic? That's not my job. My job is to make sure that it comes in, that it is working correctly and not causing performance problems. So when I say things like check your documentation and don't worry so much about whether it sounds good, unless something is like jarring, like there's this weird electric screech in the middle of the audio that clearly should not be there, then it's probably going to be technically working, and that's on the that then is on the audio person or on the director to work with. I would make a note of it, but it is not my job to say yes or no based on whether I like it or not. So I just wanted to make sure I clarified that while we were doing this. Okay, once we've gotten through all of that, which generally doesn't take very long, once we move to the viewport checks, we put a copy of the asset into the level. And like I said, I usually try to make sure that the neutral lighting is present, like the base level kind of setup. That way, if there is a problem, it should be visible in that lighting setup. Like things like flat or not flat normal, but things like inverted normals, things like um, pixels that are out of place, that or vertices that are out of place, so you can actually see like little spikes on the asset, or if it's like, running an animation or something, weird stretching or UV stretching, things like that. All of those things we want to go over. We want to make sure that, and this one is extremely rare. I've only seen it once or twice, and one of them was my fault. um, Assets where you place it in the level and you immediately see a frame rate drop. Uh, that's not a good sign. Like, having an asset that takes your frame rate and tanks it, that's a problem and should be fixed. You need to figure out what the problem is, because it could be any number of things. Like I said, it could be high poly, it could be too many bones or too dense. It could be things like the texel density is way too high, or the you know texture maps that you're using are 8K textures and it's supposed to be a 512 by 512. So just making sure that that doesn't happen. Um, Check things like your LEDs, your MIP maps. Usually, the way I check those is by simply moving panning the camera slowly away and seeing if they pop correctly. Because they do, they pop, generally speaking, unless you're using nanite. Uh, but you want to make sure that it's kind of as unnoticeable as possible. You don't want it to be a very jarring experience. Um, it's kind of it's very important to make sure that that's happening. An area that we hadn't really touched yet is mesh density. So this ties directly pretty much to poly count, in that the kind of denser an area of polygons, the more performance heavy it is. So if you have an asset, let's say like a sphere, right? And this sphere, for whatever reason, has 100,000 triangles on it. Way too many. Um, One of the things you'll notice is if you switch to wireframe mode, you can actually see how dense those triangles are. And what you can do is, if you position your camera like just over top of the asset and then slowly pull back, what you should see eventually, and this is where you know it's wrong, is that the asset eventually looks like a solid object. It just is a big blob of sphere. Uh, if you do that and it's fairly close, like I would say within the first couple LODs, um, then that is too dense for that mesh. And what you'll find oftentimes is, if you angle it and then pull up a little bit, if you go up to about where LOD 1 would pop, uh, generally speaking, that is the easiest time to notice that a mesh is going to be too dense, because you will see it. It will look like a solid wireframe object. You will not be able to really see through the object. And I'll show you kind of what I mean by that when we get to it. Going in and So if you're in a game that has like projectile collision and things like that, or if you have player collision and if it's relevant, checking to make sure that your collision actually works in play and editor. So things like, if it's a car or something, your player runs into the car, or doesn't just clip through it, or if you shoot it, that the bullets are actually registering as projectiles hitting that surface correctly. Just make sure that's kind of working. Make sure that if it has physics or movement or things like that, that each of those things are acting in accordance to what your project needs. Lastly, for this thing, use visualizers. So there's a whole slew of visualizers inside of Unreal Editor that you can use to go through and actually see things like your normals, see things like I believe they have like metalness and roughness, and your light density and things like that. So we'll go through a couple of the different options uh, when we get to the live example, and I'll show you kind of what I mean. Okay, so now that we've gone through all of that, I'm going to walk through kind of a practical example. The assets here, I made them. They were made specifically to show some of the problems. So they're not very pretty. It's not, this is not like an aesthetically pleasing asset that we're going to be looking at. So just so you know, the issues that they have are intentional. Um, and like I said, this is going to seem like a lot. It's really not. once you get used to it, this thing flies by. I was able, um, following kind of this guideline that I put forward, I was generally able to finish each asset in about 20 minutes. I ended up kind of cutting our processing time for the asset pipeline in half following these steps. So it seems like a lot, and I know I've thrown a lot at you at the forefront here, but hopefully watching me go through it will make a little bit of sense and that it will clarify a few things. Um, so let me go ahead. We're gonna hit this. Let's do this. Okay, and the final thoughts will be for later. Apologies, I hit the wrong button. And then there we go. Okay, so now we are on my desktop here. And so I've got this asset validation folder, and inside you will see that I have created a folder called source assets. Don't call it source because Unreal actually assumes that a folder with source in it, or a folder just named source, that it has C++ files in it. So we don't want to mess with that. That is actually like what the source builds and stuff like that have. So we call it source assets or something like that. So just a little differentiation to make sure that we know this is where our source assets are from, but it is not interfering with how Unreal likes to read files. So in here, we've got like, if you have textures or meshes, a lot of this is empty, by the way. It's just there for, or like, yeah, see, I put like a paint mask in here for things. But a lot of this is just empty to give the thing. So in here we got SM box. Okay, so we have our little pipeline asset here. We've got like the FBX. If we had a substance for ZBrush, they'd be here. Actually, did I have a substance? No. Okay, cool. So then we open it up. I've already got this open, and so you can kind of see this box. And I've made a couple of different variations so that we could see without having to recreate the whole thing what I'm talking about. For now, let's just look at this box, right? So it's pretty cool. It works. If you look at the naming convention, in our case, this naming convention would be correct. We're using the precursor. So in my case, I use static mesh, what the static mesh is, and then a number variation. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Other ones might not have that. So let's see, where did I put? Had another, oh yeah, right here. So we have this one. This is box. As you can see, it's just named box. It's not got any number conventions. You can kind of see that there's errors all over the place. So like right here, if I go into this and select right up here, it's got like these loose things going on that the artist would want to get rid of. It's got this weird hanging thing that's not really doing anything. Not sure that that's supposed to be there. So I'd probably make a note of this to be like, hey, why is this here? And one of the things, all right, so errors, questions, warnings. Probably put questions here, pass. So already for this one, we would say like this one for the box. So this is just called box, right? Notes, not correctly named, SM box, blah, blah. So it's going, or sorry, this should go in errors. Something like that. Okay, so in this case, what I'm doing is basically making a listing for myself of what each problem is. I am not going to stop the test unless there is a like reason that I cannot continue. So things like I put the asset in the editor and it crashes the editor, so I literally cannot import it or something like that. At that point, I would stop the test, but otherwise, we're going to test every single part of this, and then just compile the list at the end, or compile the list and then make a nicer listing. This is just my way of kind of documenting it for myself. So question, let's see, like hanging polys intended, kind of thing. So then we come in, and we can just see like this thing clearly has a lot of problems, right? Uh, way too dense. It's got 80,000 triangles, so too many triangles, stuff like that. If you look at, let's see, it's not this. Alright. Oh, yeah, I set it on this. Okay. So things like this, having like the pivot is in the wrong spot. Bad pivot. You can see that I've got this armature here that isn't attached correctly, and it's actually way too many bones for a box. Why would you need that many? So too many bones. Armature not aligned with box/rigged correctly. So things like that. I'm not going to do the more text document stuff for the rest of it. That was just for an example of how I would handle something like this. But so that's kind of like the bad one, right? And then looking at the material preview, you can see it's got materials that it's got way too many materials for this size of an asset. Like it's got 3 different ones. For this, I actually think I have 4 on here. Where are my materials? Okay, yeah. So I've actually got 4 materials, so 2 of them are even doing the same thing. It's just one's metal and one's not. So instead of that, you would probably want to just have a mask or something, or use the same thing and then change the data slightly. But doing it this way is just wrong. Checking to make sure, you can see that this UV is very sloppy in general. I believe the UV on this one is still going to be sloppy. Yeah, there we go. And then let's go. Yeah, so that's something like I would fail this because it's got these UVs that clearly aren't very well laid out in here. And it would actually fail in the UV light checks because it's got overlapping UVs. And that's even on the one that is mostly good for the most part. This one, I created a separate, or sorry, where are you? There it is. Okay, so I created a separate box that's more like the first box, and it's weighted just to this bone. So there we go. Yeah, so you can see it's just a single bone, not doing anything super crazy. Oh, there we go. And then it's already checked to make sure it's properly weighted. Seems to be just fine. Not pretty, not good, but fine. It does the job that it was supposed to do. Once we've gotten to this point, so we've checked pretty much everything we need to check inside of the DCC program. We want to make sure that we go in and check the export settings. So for exporting as FBX, we want to make sure that it's X forward, Z up. And this is kind of specific to Unreal. I would make sure that selected objects is generally checked if they have other stuff in here. So if they have like lights, cameras, other objects, things like that, you want to make sure that you're only getting what you actually want pulled. And then you go ahead, make sure that it's named correctly. In this case, I would want it to be SM box 00, and then export. Now we've already done this part, so I'm not going to do it again. But that's pretty much everything in the DCC checks. Let me minimize that. So the next part is making sure that it gets put to the proper folder structure, like I said, I like to set the folder structure up first anyways. So, I already had SM box put in here. We had the blender for the blended asset. I set up the FBX, and then we moved the FBX asset in here. And if there were others, they could go elsewhere. Uh, now that we've got that, we go into the editor. We want to make sure that we set up the folder structure that we actually want. So let's see, we need to add, no, not collection. That was my bad. Why is it fighting me? Oh, because I didn't hit content. That was a little mistake on my part. Okay. So you do like meshes, right? It's important to note, I've got meshes here. I want to make sure that it's actually highlighted so that it knows this is where I want this imported. Then we can go in here, we go to asset validation, source assets, meshes, box, FBX. One thing to note is that I did not put the source assets inside of the content folder. Some people do this. I do not recommend it. The reason is that when you put those additional FBX assets or blend files or things like that inside of the folders that your regular content is going out of, it can cause a lot of confusion and problems because that folder gets so cluttered. It becomes a hot mess to try to organize. It is much better to have a separate source assets thing. That way, if there's a problem, you can make edits to it in that source assets folder instead of attempting to figure out which assets that you're trying to work with, going through possibly, accidentally deleting something or moving things around or getting in the way or not reading correctly. It just causes all sorts of a headache. So it is better to have it out in its own separate folder inside of the folder structure. All right, so we hit open. And then in here, at least as far as I have seen, 9 times out of 10, you don't have to make any changes. If you're importing with a skeletal mesh, you want to make sure that it's got the correct, that it's all coming in correctly. I don't believe this one has that, so we just do that. It comes in with a material. I personally do not like having my materials in the same place as my meshes. I prefer doing like this. Or it's kind of different, different strokes. One thing you could do is have them set up and then you do like SM box inside of your meshes. And then you just put these in here, right? I personally like to keep my materials separate from my meshes. So I would probably do this. And then move that there. At this point, I have now moved these assets. As I said earlier, if you right-click content, update redirector references, that's all you have to do to fix redirectors. It just does it for you, and now you don't have to deal with it. Do it. Every time, please do it. Just do it. I can't stress that enough. Do it. Okay. So now we go in here. We got the SM box. I'll usually go ahead and get it open and then do my content browser checks because that way I can just kind of switch between the two quickly. So I've made sure name's correct, folder structure's correct, redirectors are fixed up. Let's see, there's a validation in here that I run at the end. So what I like to do is do validate asset independencies just to make sure that there's no errors that come up. I'll check the initial thing here because let's see, it's one of the last things we did. So yeah, this is where we did everything. So yeah, you can see there's no smoothing group information. So I would make a note of that as a warning. No smoothing group information. Boom. I would also do the, render bounds, stuff like that. Most of these, I haven't found them to be particularly difficult to work around, but I make notes of them anyways because if it's going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem, and I'd rather it be listed as something to check. Okay. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. So already I can see that there are a few problems with this asset, things that I did not catch. You can see here that these spots that are really, really weirdly shaded black, uh, that is most likely, like, let me see. I think that's probably inverted normals, but not sure. Okay. Yeah, you can use these visualizers here as well to kind of see different things about the asset. It's very helpful. So make sure to use these visualizers. You can also check your simple collision, which would be like your player collision, your complex collision if you're doing projectile stuff. Just making sure that all of that loads in correctly and is generated correctly. Um, if you need to change collision, you can use this box here. There's actually all sorts of stuff, like you can remove collision here. You can kind of make it much more detailed. You can do auto convex. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with that. So very, 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 very helpful. Um, maybe it is just the way the light's hitting because it's neutral lighting. I don't think so. I think this is a problem, but I would just probably make note of this and be like, hey, double check these areas. Is this okay? Because this is what I'm seeing. Um, you can also check it with like a different material just to make sure. Like one of the things you can do, since this came in with a basic material, let's just move that out of the way and let's go with like an obnoxious material, right? Let's go with our debug pink, my favorite. So do that. Yeah, see, I would say this is problematic because you can kind of see right in here that it doesn't look smooth like the rest of the asset. So at that point, I would say, you know, normals in, let's see, sunken square areas seem inverted. Double check. That way, the artist gets an idea. A lot of this I'm doing kind of quickly, just to make sure that we can kind of discuss. But a lot of it comes down to just making sure that you're conveying the information in a way that is clear, concise, and friendly with the artist. Um, so checking that is good. Okay, double checking your LODs. So in this case, this doesn't have any additional LODs, so I don't have to do that. Most likely, yeah, it just kind of goes to flat default. Um, the LOD information, if you need to make changes, I believe there is actually a, yeah, so we've got LOD auto here. You can actually change the LOD group if you wanted, if you wanted this to be like a large prop or something. Do that. Now it's got all these extra LODs that you can kind of click through and get an idea of what you're looking at. So just making sure that those are looking good, that they look correct, making sure that overall the UVs look correct, that in this case, as we discussed earlier, the UVs are bad, so I would fail this based on the UVs. Let's see, nothing in there. Um, Checking it in unlit can be very helpful just to see if there's anything that's kind of standing out that's not related to lighting. Um, Usually not. Let's see. So checking things like your GPU cache to or things like that. Um, Checking your lighting complexity to make sure that you want it to stay kind of in the blue to green area. Um, a couple of hero assets could go higher, but generally you want to make sure that that's all good. Shader complexity is a very important one. Let me turn off my UVs here. So shader complexity tends to be materials, textures, stuff like that, and you do not want it to be in this extremely bad area. You want it to kind of sit in the green. A little bit of red might be okay. Once you start getting up here, it becomes much more performance intensive. So you generally want to avoid that unless you have very specific reasons for that asset to have that high of a shader complexity, um, and that you need to be aware of what those are, what they're doing, and why. Now, mesh UV density. This is kind of similar to what I was talking about with the mesh density, but this is actually looking at the UVs to see if it's done well. Um, in this case, I can't even tell because it's just rendering pink. So let me try. This one isn't even showing, so let's. Mm, Looks good, I guess. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to double check. This not sure how well the UV density thing actually is working here. So until I get more testing on it, I can't say for certain to use that. It may be better to just check it yourself. Um, Visibility collision, player collision. Yeah. So double check. Those things are really good, really easy to use kind of stuff. Um, then we're going to go in. And I don't like using this level because it's really big and unnecessary. I would just use like this. This is what I mean when I say like default lighting, just like the most basic of basic stuff. You just take the cube, you place it in. Make sure that it's actually looking pretty okay. And see in here, those areas actually look pretty good. The area that I had pointed out that looked problematic. So it may be, and this is something that comes up a little bit, is that the sub-editor's windows are sometimes set differently than the actual level viewport windows. And so you get differing effects. And that's why we do the checks in both places. Because like here, you can see this looks fine. It's not doing that weird janky stuff that it was doing inside of the sub-editor. Now, I would not say it's I would not say it's fine. I would say this happened in the sub-editor. Double check the normals. I would move it probably up to like a question for them to check as opposed to just saying it's wrong. Uh, just to be sure, if that makes sense. Please let me know. If you want to comment or anything, just to let me know if something doesn't make sense. Please let me know, and I will be happy to take another look and see what we can do. Okay, so we've checked that. Uh, we want to check and make sure when we come in here, if you have collision, like in this case, you can see I can't go through this. If I had projectiles, you could fire at it or throw grenades or take cover on it or jump up on top of it, um, to double check and make sure that if it's acting correctly, that it all is going to be fine. Um, that's like a few minutes check, and checking the LEDs. Yeah, look, it's LEDing, it's fine. Um, and that's all. That's kind of the entirety of the play and editor checks for the most part. Is just making sure that things are not gonna freak out when you actually play an editor, because we have had situations in the past where something seems fine and then you put it in the editor and all of a sudden everything breaks when you play with it, and it's like, I don't know why it broke. Well, if you had done these checks, you would have known it was going to break and you could get it fixed. Um, okay, so when I was talking about mesh density earlier, not the check in the sub editor, but I mean like way earlier. This is what I meant. So if you turn on the wireframe and look down, right, you can see the general shape of this asset. And then if I start kind of slowly going out, LED 1 popped, and you can still see broken areas. So you can tell it's still a wireframe. But eventually, like if I, there we go. If I do like that, you can see most of it is solid now. But there's still that big break in the middle. That means it's still a wireframe. If this was just a square, a solid square, with no breakage in the middle here, I would say this is too dense. This is actually hitting close to too dense because of the rest of it. But because it has those larger sections in the middle, it doesn't really register as too dense. So that's something that you really want to make sure that you're kind of double checking on, because you can have areas like in this. I would say I would probably put in a recommendation to possibly decimate the outside areas to kind of break it up a bit, but it wouldn't fail per se. I would still say it's not the best. It's not the ideal. And you can do it from the sides too. It's just usually from the top is the easiest way to do it, just for keeping the camera kind of level. Excuse me, sorry. But if this had shown up and this was just like this entire thing was just a square and it was solid in that view, then you're looking at an asset that's way too performance intensive. It is way too big. One of the things you can do as well, if you type stat FPS, you get FPS here, frame rate. So if I delete this, you can see that my frame rate does not change. Yay! That means it's not horribly affecting the frame rate. If I put this in here and I saw like a 5-point FPS drop for one asset, especially for one box, then yeah, I'd be like, oh, okay, something's wrong. That's not good. um, so that's just an easy check that you can do. I'm trying to think if there's anything other than that really major things here. We go. A lot of these are the same checks that we were doing earlier. If you need to do ray trace stuff, you can kind of check the like. Generally, I don't see any reason to do a lot of these for this specific check. Um, this actually is a pretty good visualization, so you can actually see, oh, there's a lot of triangles right in this area, kind of thing. This is actually pretty reasonably helpful for that. Oh, I was hitting the button. Let's see, you can see like the virtual shadow maps if you need to work, or if you're looking at like virtual textures and things like that. So all in all, pretty good stuff. Double check your buffers. Um, the main ones that I would recommend is like if it's metallic, you want to make sure that it's actually registering as metallic, which generally it does. You want to check your roughness. The big one though is normals. Where is my normals? And I wish this introduction thing would go away. I don't know why it's doing that. So my apologies if that's showing up. I haven't bothered to double check on it. Let's go. Visualizers. Normal. There we go. So yeah, this is one of the ones that I consider kind of a big one, is making sure your normals look good. Um, in general, the way to know that it isn't good is whichever color is prominent here, if there's like a stark difference between that and the stuff kind of around it, because it all should be kind of facing, generally speaking, the correct way. So like this is facing the X direction, therefore it gets red. This is facing the Y direction, it gets green. So if this was like all of a sudden red on like this face, you can kind of look at it and go, oh, that's a problem. I don't know why it's doing that. And that could be something to write down, make sure. Um, oops, I knocked myself out of my slideshow. My bad. Oh, no, I didn't. I just opened up a different thing. Got it. Okay. Trying to think if there's anything else that really. Okay. Yeah. So at this point, I would say most likely you've kind of got a good idea of what you're doing. You know, not what you're doing, but like once you've gone through this process, you've gotten to this point in the process. You have a good idea whether this asset is going to pass or fail. And there's kind of a couple of things to consider when you're thinking about that. The first and most important, if there are problems with the asset. So in this case, let's take a look at the errors that we found with our stuff, right? Are there are there a lot of them? If there's a lot of them, the rest of the questions really don't matter. uh, so let's say I would usually say 3 or more errors, and I'm just sending it back to the artist with any of the information that I've gathered. I'm going to rewrite this to make sure that it looks, that it's in a format. I used to have a kind of a outline that I went down, and I would just fill it out with detailed information. And I actually eventually got to the point where things like bad pivot, right? So I used to have a list of things where I'd be like, the pivot for this asset is incorrectly located. Can you move the pivot to better fit the asset's use case? Or something like that. So a very simple thing like that. And I would just copy this, paste it in, boom. That's the error. And that way, um, what you're sending the artist is consistent every time you send it. So if there's going to be a problem, they're going to get the same detailed information unless it needs to be changed. So things like too many triangles, I don't need to be like, this is 80,000 triangles or whatever. I could just be like, your triangles are over budget. Um, please, pull this back into the $5,000 or the 5,000 triangles limit that the listed in the documentation here. I don't need to sit there and just over and over and over again give them the exact granular kind of stuff. I trust that they're smart enough to figure it out. Things like not correctly named. The naming convention is wrong. Please use our naming convention listed in this documentation. Uh, that level of information is fine. If it needs to be more specific, like if you found a very specific set of vertices that were wrong or something like that, then yes, get more granular at that point. But you know, you have to kind of use a bit of judgment and figure out whether or not this is something that the artist needs a very detailed response on, or if you can give them the general information and let them source it out. And if they have questions, they can come talk to you. Um, so once you get that done, and like I said, uh, sorry, let me rephrase. Uh, in the event that there's a lot of 3 or more errors, then yeah, I'm just sending it back to the artist with that information. If it is 2 or less errors, but that they're errors that I cannot solve myself, I will just send it back to the artist. If it is 2 or less errors and they are things that I can solve, then what I will do is I will contact the artist and say, hey, this is almost ready to go, but I found these issues. Do you mind if I go and fix them? Uh, the reason I do that is there's a couple reasons for it. The first, you're building a good rapport with your artist. That is very important. This is not supposed to be a adversarial relationship. It is supposed to be a cooperative and collaborative one. So building a good rapport with your artist and being like, hey, do you mind if I go and make changes to your asset, comes off a lot better than, hey, I'm going to do this. um, it's all about just how you communicate and how you talk to people at that point. The second thing is it allows you the opportunity to go in and make meaningful changes and get work off of your artist so they can move on to other things. More often than not, unless it's something specific, when I ask, hey, do you mind if I make this change? The answer is, yeah, go right ahead. Please do. Thank you. Like that's generally the answer that you get to that. If they don't say that, if they say no, don't make the change. Send it back to them. No problem. It's off your shoulders, back on theirs. The asset's already in the level, and you just have to re-import and then run the tests that are for anything changes. If it does fail the validation, you send it back to the artist. The next time they send it back, you don't have to run the full validation check. You just have to re-import and then check what was changed. I would do like a light pass just to make sure nothing else broke. But in general, once it's already past that portion of the validation, the only thing you're doing is improving. So, uh, if you send it back to the artist, they send it back. You go, cool, this is ready to go. You put it through the import process or through the import process again. Check the changes that they made. If they made the changes and it is now correct, you can push it on to validation passed or to the next specialist. Depending on the situation. So really, at that point, it's just a back and forth communication and just making sure that everyone is on the same page, that we all know kind of what changes went into the asset, and that there is a documentation trail showing that it has succeeded or failed and why. So I think that makes sense. I hope so. If it doesn't, please let me know. Uh, and I'm going to make one final swap here. Boom. Okay. So, final thoughts. Um, I do apologize for the kind of scattershot information here. I know it's a lot to take in. If there's any questions or anything, please feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to explain myself better. Um, I don't find myself on camera very often, so this is kind of a little bit of a test for me as well. um, Now that you do have the general process, I do highly encourage you implementing some form of validation for your studios and for your projects. Um, as I said, it seems like a lot at first, but once you get the process down, once you're going through the motions of, hey, these are the things we need to check for our assets. These are what is important to us to make sure that this is all going in the same way every time with every asset. That way, we have a smooth process. It makes things faster. It makes things easier. If there is a problem, it makes it easier to identify what the problem is. It's just in general smoothing out your process. Um, it it makes your workflow so much smoother because you don't have to worry about every single artist implementing all of their own assets and just doing kind of different things, and everyone has a different way of handling things. It's all unified. It's all clear cut and direct. And you have, you know, one person or a group of individuals that are in charge of making sure, hey, if an asset is going into my project, then it goes through these steps. They make sure that everything is clean, that everything is organized, that everything has the correct setup. This alone smooths out so many problems that I personally have experienced and have seen in projects where where you allow your artist to kind of do their own thing, and then all of a sudden everything's kind of jumbled because they're importing from the wrong locations. They've got different naming conventions that are just all over the place. You've got people not fixing up redirectors, or some people fixing up redirectors, or some people doing this, and so it just becomes this bleh. You don't want that. You don't want bleh. You want streamline. You want optimization. You want smoothness. You want to make sure that you're prioritizing optimization over speed as well. It's very important to make sure that the process is going correctly, that you document it, that you make sure that everyone is following the steps and that they are doing so consistently. This is not an area to shortchange yourself or to kind of gloss over, because the smoother this part of the process is, the smoother everything down the line becomes. And I actually included a quote from a former lead of mine who I have a lot of respect for, and he used to say all the time, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And I didn't understand that until I really started doing this process. Um, you take it slow, you do the steps, and you do it correctly, and everything else speeds up because of that, because you're doing it the right way. Um, all right, so that's going to be it for me. Thank you so much for sitting through this. I know it was a bit of a long one. It's a long one for me as well. Um, I if you have any questions or if anything didn't make sense, like I said, please put it in the comments. Send me a message. I am always happy to discuss. And if I need to make a second video or a clarifying video or something, I can do that too. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and cut this one off. Thank you so much, and have a great day.